So this is going to be part one of 4 webinars we're going to be doing on the AmeriCorps application. Today's purpose is to talk kind of overall about the application. I'm also going to do some kind of foundational setting around AmeriCorps that influences the narrative and some of the different components we're going to be talking about. And then we're going to specifically talk about the AmeriCorps narrative, which is one piece of a few that you have to submit as a part of the application. We've already done introductions, which was what I wanted to do first, so that's great. If there are any questions that you have that you'd like to make sure we answer in today's session or in future ones, because we're going to be talking about logic model, performance measures, budget, feel free to put them in the chat so we can make sure we capture them, and we'll either answer them today if it's applicable, or make sure we have that as a point of conversation in some of the future sessions. So I know it sounds a little weird, but I'd like to start first with talking just a little bit about AmeriCorps, because there are pieces about AmeriCorps that you have to understand as you begin to work on these different grant application elements, one of which is the focus areas. Typically, AmeriCorps programs fall into one of what we call a few different focus areas. They're the ones you see on the screen. They don't have much implication in anything except for your performance measures. So I want to introduce them to you just briefly now, because they're going to show up again when we have our 3rd webinar on performance measures, because you could fall in and probably a few different focus areas depending upon what your activities are and what hope your outcomes to be. You may naturally think that you might be in the education area because you're an education-based organization, but in reality, your program might fall more under healthy futures, as an example. So really it depends on your interventions and your overall goals. And again, we'll come back to that when we talk about performance measures, but I just want to talk briefly about each one. Disaster services, which none of you all represent on today's call, is about, but it's definitely responding to disasters, recovering from disasters, and helping prepare for and get ready for disasters. We have programs that are focused on economic opportunity, where people are helping to maybe help enhance financial literacy, help transition into or remain in affordable housing, focus on employability. There's a lot of different things in this bucket. For education, there are kind of 3 different buckets of programs that fall under this. There are some that are helping kids get ready for school. There are some that are serving kids in school, whether it's K through 12. And then there's some that are helping get kids to and through college. Those activities vary. They could be direct tutoring activities. They could be mentoring. They could be case management around social emotional learning or youth mental health. They can be a whole bunch of different things. And then there's environmental stewardship, which none of you guys are in that world, but it's, focusing on ecosystem improvements, energy efficiency, renewable energy use, and more. Healthy Futures is about a few different things. A lot of Healthy Future programs are focusing on the mental health piece and primary preventative health care. Some are focusing on keeping seniors in their homes. Some are focusing on increasing nutrition and physical activity amongst young people or adults. A lot of different diverse programming in this area. And then we have the veterans and military families. So they're working specifically either with veterans and military families, or really intentionally engaging members, engaging veterans and military family members as members. So that's just a little snapshot of them. Again, I just want to introduce them to you because we're going to come back to them when we talk about performance measures, because you'll have to think about what focus area you think you're in, and that will help you determine what measures you pick, which we'll talk about at another time. The other thing I like to talk about are the guiding principles that make AmeriCorps unique, because as you write your application, you really have to understand this, because you'll have to integrate some of these elements into your application, particularly the narrative that we're going to be talking about today. Just real briefly, they're getting things done, they're strengthening communities, They're the member experience and their brand and core identification. I call these the legs of the stool because if you don't have one of them present, your stool's going to fall over. If you have all of them present, you're going to have a really strong AmeriCorps program, or you should. Today, we're really going to be talking about the get things done and member experience piece in terms of the narrative. But I do like to always start with that because no matter what programs focus on, these are the things that they integrate into their program. We will talk a little bit about strength and communities too, but so the get things done is about focus, impact, and activities, having evidence that your intervention is going to lead to something. The member experience is about really helping to support the members and having a strong experiencing and developing them personally and professionally. Brand and core identification is about really integrating that A and understanding the larger identity of national service. And strength and communities has a lot of different buckets in it. Today, we'll talk about the volunteer integration piece and diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. But again, all of these are really important. I want to touch a little bit on two of them because they show up in your narrative and will also show up in your logic model and ultimately your performance measures. So the get things done piece is really fundamental to AmeriCorps programs. And I'm going to talk about all these elements right now. The first thing that you're going to have to do is demonstrate that there's a need. There's one or more problems in your community that makes you think you need to have this AmeriCorps program. And you're going to have to start to gather data that demonstrates that need. And you're going to have to communicate that in your AmeriCorps narrative and in your logic model, which we'll talk about on the next one. From that, you're going to have to also think about well thought out activities that will help address the problem. And you're going to have to think about, what kind of member you're going to want in that program based upon those activities, and a few other things that I'll talk about in a second. Some programs have very singular activities. They have like one or two things that members do, and that's all they do. And some programs have more diverse activities or have a bucket of members do this and a bucket of members do that. There's all kinds of ways you can craft your AmeriCorps program. However, the more diverse your activities, the more challenging it can be to operate. So you just have to know the more complicated your model is, the more things you're going to have to think about in the planning time to get ready for managing that type of complexity. And based upon the activities you think you've outlined for your AmeriCorps members, you're going to have to be able to, one, show in your grant application that you have some information or evidence that your program is likely going to lead to success. Like you believe if your members do these activities, they're going to see these results. And over time, you're going to be expected to collect information that shows the impact of your AmeriCorps members. So it's kind of twofold. The time before, when you're writing your application, you have to give some information that's saying, hey, we think these activities are likely going to work. And then there's after, you're going to have to be able to decide on information you can collect to share the story of your program and to share your evidence. We'll talk more about that in a bit. We'll make these slides available to you. I think there's some really good questions that are important for you to consider as you're thinking about your application, and particularly your narrative and logic model. I'm going to admit Mary, she's here. Okay. It's what are you currently doing that you're not reaching the scale, scope, or reach of what you want to do? What are the problems, areas, or gaps that you're not meeting? If you could wave your magic wand, what would you want to do with these members in the program? These are great questions to kind of think about, and welcome, Mary. And then that should lead to, I'm not sure why I'm not advancing. There we go. This leads to kind of what activities do we want members to do? Are any of them potentially things we think might not be allowed? And you'll start learning about prohibited and allowable activities at some point. Where would members serve? Are all members doing the same thing? Yes or no? If no, how many buckets of activities are you considering? Of those buckets, are each member doing all of them, or groups of members assigned to a particular bucket? Like you have all kinds of possibilities to think about and how you shape your model. And then you have to think about like how many members are you thinking about? When are they serving? The days, the hours per day or week, the length of their service term, because all of that will help inform what kind of member you want to have in terms of types. And because you have to think about what kind of members make the most sense. A typical thing we see a lot of planning grants do is they mistakenly say right off the bat, we're just going to have 10 full-time members. But when they break down the activities and think about the time frame and when they're going to be serving, they realize, oh, we can't do full time. We need to really think about a different time slot. So you all have some different opportunities to think about different service terms. Each service term has a minimum hours that members have to complete in their time frame. Members can serve up to 12 months. Typically, most programs have members serve around an 11-month time frame. Some have summer only components. Some have just school year components, serving just during the school year. You have the ability to think about that start and end time and how many hours a week they'll be serving, which will then inform the service term you consider. You could have, just like the activities we talked about, you could have all of one type, or you could have some of one type and some of another type. It depends on the activities that you're thinking about. We're going to talk in the budget about some of the terms you see on the screen, like MSY slots. We'll talk about that in the budget, but we're just sharing you the service terms right now. And then that leads to some other questions like, who do I need to engage with as I'm developing and planning this AmeriCorps program? What will it take to support the program I'm considering in terms of staff, supervision, recruitment, retention, training, data collection, reporting, and more in the fiscal and grants management side of it. These will show up in the second session we talk about in terms of logic model and your budget. And then finally, there's the guiding principles around the strong member experience, and some of which you're going to have to talk about in your narrative. You're going to have to think about how you're going to equip members to carry out the activities you're asking them to do. And in addition, it is expected that you're going to help develop them personally and professionally to develop skills and to have opportunities to practice leadership. And then, of course, our hope is that you engage them in training and opportunities that broaden the lens in which they see this world. And all these elements show up in your narrative and logic model for sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some application fundamentals, and then we're going to jump into the narrative portion. So first, I just want to talk about who is eligible. There's a lot of different entities that can be eligible for an AmeriCorps application. They can be nonprofit organizations, they can be schools or school districts, they can be higher education institutions, they can be government agencies, Indian tribes. And then there's also what we call different types of applicants. All of you all would be new applicants because you have not previously received an AmeriCorps grant. So this is your first application. If you were awarded funding, you get funded typically for 3 years, a 3-year cycle, contingent upon available funding, that you don't mess up completely, that you're good stewards of the fund. I mean, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to have learning lessons, but we're talking about egregious stuff. You should then enter into what's called a continuation application in years 2 and 3. So this time you'll do a full application called a new application. If you're awarded funding, the next 2 years you would submit what's called a continuation application. And then at the end of or as you enter into your 3rd year, you would do what's called a recompete. So you recompete every 3 years for an AmeriCorps grant. In order to start your new application, there's a couple of things that you're going to have to start to do. And one of them I do like right away. You have to create an account in eGrants. eGrants is the system right now that we use to submit our AmeriCorps grants. So you're going to have to create an account. And all these will be in the instructions that the Virginia Commission will issue sometime, I think, in early February. But you all are going to have these slides so you can start working on them now. You also must have an active SAM registration. It's called the System for Award Management, and you have to maintain that active SAM registration throughout your application and program operations. So if you're funded, you have to keep that alive. AmeriCorps suggests that you do this several weeks before your application deadline because it does take a few weeks to get finalized. So, and if you have any issues that arise, which some organizations do, it's really good to start that sooner than later. You have to use your SAM registered legal name and physical address on all of your grant applications to AmeriCorps. So your legal applicant name and physical address in the grant must match exactly what's put into SAM. That's a hiccup that some people encounter because they didn't put the exact things. And your applications must also include what's called a unique entity identifier. They call it the UEI. And that's generated as a part of your SAM registration process. So that's one of the reasons why you have to do it. So you can generate that UEI number. I had to do it recently for myself. So it's not a difficult process, but it just takes some time. So that'll be something you all want to do. These are, I'm just showing you a screenshot of the application components that you're going to have to complete. Today, we're going to be talking about the narrative specifically, but there's several other things, the logic model, performance measures, budget. There's some basic demographic information. We'll kind of try to highlight that at some different times. But one of the big elements is the narrative. It's 11 pages as it prints out in the system called eGrants that does not equate to a Word document of 11 pages. Kind of equates to maybe a Word document of 8 pages, single spaced. So don't assume that your Word document is equivalent to the eGrants. And that includes the standard face sheet. So the face sheet, which is a part of all grant applications, starts on page 1, and then the narrative will officially start on page 2. So we're going to spend some time talking about the narrative, and I'll pause if at some point soon to see if y'all have any questions. And if you have questions, also don't hesitate to put them in the chat. So the AmeriCorps narrative is broken up into the sections you see here, which we're going to go into. Again, no more than 11 pages, including the face sheet. The commission will be issuing their notice of funding opportunity or request for applications, and they might have some varied elements in their application that may be a little different from what you see here, but for the most part, it will be the same. So there's nothing from stopping you all to start working on this now, and don't wait until their No For RFA comes out in February. Start working on it now. Because these essentially the elements will be the same. So we're going to walk through all of these and talk to you a little bit about each. And Alyssa, you having a question, or are you just clapping and saying yes?
No, I was just clapping and saying yes.
Okay.
And I'll also just mention that the youth mental health core piece will be in a supplement or in an appendix, so it won't count towards your page limit here. But yes,
Great.
would definitely echo what
Okay.
Amy said. Starting as early as you can, and then also making sure to let us know if you have questions. The RFA is going to be pretty similar to the RFA from last year, and so it's really great if we can help you answer your questions now before the RFA is released and state procurement rules come into play.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Okay, so let's talk about these elements. Some are more complicated than others, and I'll try to point those out as we go on. The executive summary should be the easiest thing you do. It's a template, it's required, you just fill in the blanks. I had an organization yesterday write 3 pages of an executive summary. And I'm like, no, it's a template. You fill in the blanks. Where you see brackets, you insert your information. There's one paragraph that's standard for everybody. Your second paragraph is dependent upon what kind of budget you're submitting. My assumption is that all of you all will be submitting what's called a cost reimbursement budget, which we'll talk about on our 4th webinar. But depending upon the budget type you submit, you choose one of the last 2 second paragraphs. Again, the first paragraph will be the same. Insert your stuff into the brackets. The second paragraph will be dependent upon your budget type. That's the easiest section of them all. The more complicated section, in my experience with grant applicants, is this first one, the program design. There's 4 sections within it. It's the first 2 that I think are the most complicated for everybody. So my goal will be to help kind of walk you through that. The first section in program design is called community and logic model. What makes it so confusing is that there are 2 pieces that are reviewed for this section to give you the full point allocation. So there's narrative that you're going to write, and there's the logic model document that we'll talk about on webinar 2. Both of those are read together to give the full point allocation. Okay, I'm going to talk about the narrative portion today. We'll talk about the logic model document on our next call. In the narrative, ultimately, the main thing you all are going to do is talk about the problem. You're going to paint a picture to the reviewers of the problem that your community or communities are encountering with good data and information. Your problem information should communicate the severity and prevalence of the problem. And it should also include the role that current or historical inequities play in contributing to that problem. Additionally, they ask that your narrative includes how the CDC, the Center for Disease Control's Social Vulnerability Index, explains the extent of the problem. There's a link that's provided. If you go there, you can pull data on your counties or census tracts and write a brief narrative about how that relates to the problem. Ultimately, the Social Vulnerability Index is about rating counties and or census tracts and how vulnerable they are in times of disaster, whether it's health or natural disasters. So they kind of rate counties and census tracts on different areas, socioeconomic, housing and transportation, a racial breakdown, a few different areas. Okay, that's the narrative for this section. You're not really talking a lot about your intervention. You can talk about how your intervention will lead to the outcomes that you see in your logic model, but your logic model document will really convey what your program is about. So we'll talk more about that next week. The evidence-based section consists of kind of 2 pieces. Ultimately, they're assessing you based upon what's called a tier. There's 4 different levels of evidence that you can speak to in your application. And they'll also look at the quality of what you wrote. So they're going to assess you on your tier and assess you on the evidence you provided for that tier. So ultimately, AmeriCorps has 4 evidence levels that they define that they ask applicants to speak to. So you have to talk about the intervention that you're proposing. What evidence do you have that it will lead to success? The evidence levels range from a very low level to a very high level. Most new applicants are at a very low level, unless they're taking on an intervention that's been done by others, that they're doing the same. Most new programs start out at the low level. So don't worry if you don't have high level evidence, you are where you are. So I'm going to talk you through those evidence levels and then tell you a little bit about things that you should be putting in this section. If you're pre-preliminary, that's the lowest level of evidence. It means you haven't done any kind of an evaluation, outcome or impact. You just maybe have some basic data on things you've done in a similar intervention in your organization, or you have research out there in the field that says these things might work. Okay. It means, again, you have done no higher level evaluation on this intervention you're proposing. Maybe you've collected some basic data in your own organization. Maybe you've done this intervention on a smaller scale, or you're wanting to replicate something you're already doing, but you don't have enough people to do it to reach everyone that needs to be served. You can share that kind of data. Or again, you have research from others that says this type of intervention is likely to work. Then there's the preliminary level, which means you have kind of a step up. You've done what we call an outcome evaluation. It's not a high level impact evaluation, but you've done some kind of an evaluation that's larger than just collecting basic data. You've done some evaluation to answer some larger question of a change. You haven't done any kind of, you're not comparing two groups like a control group, one that gets the intervention versus one that doesn't. You're just doing a simple outcome evaluation. Um, and you also probably have some basic data. Okay. So that's like the next level. The other levels of moderate or strong means you've done a high level evaluation, what we call an impact evaluation. It means you have done that comparison. You've looked at what's happened to a group of people that are getting the intervention versus a group of people that are not. The evaluation language is randomized control trial and quasi-experimental design. Moderate means you've done it within your own community or area. Strong simply means it has a farther reach. You've done it statewide or national or regionally with a few states. So it's the same type of evaluation, but you have a broader scope to talk about it with. Okay. My recommendation for you all is to think about where you think you fall on those 4 levels, and then in your narrative, speak to that level. So ultimately, in that narrative section, you have to describe any evidence you have that what you're proposing is going to work. Again, that could be past data you've collected, research studies, or an evaluation. If your evidence includes an evaluation that you're discussing, either an outcome or an impact, you have to summarize the evaluation design and any key findings from that evaluation. Okay, I'm going to say again, if you use an evaluation in this section that you're talking about for your evidence, you have to summarize what you did and any outcomes that were learned from it. If the evaluation is not one that you did, it's one that another person, another organization did, and you're using that evidence as your own because you're going to replicate their intervention, you have to talk about how you're the same as that entity. So you still talk about the study design, you still talk about the outcomes that were learned, but you also have to talk about the bullets you see here. You have to talk about how you're the same on the characteristics of the beneficiary population, the characteristics of the population delivering the intervention, the dosage and design of the intervention, and the context in which the intervention is delivered. Again, if you're using an evaluation that another organization has done as your evidence because you're saying you're doing something similar or the same, you have to show it on these areas, on these 4 areas. Okay. And then in the information, there's like quality elements that they'll look for. So if you're proposing a preliminary, moderate, or strong evidence level, they're going to rate that on like, are the reports submitted? Do they match what you should have submitted? Are they done within the last 6 years? Do they show some meaningful and significant effect on either beneficiaries or members that you have outlined in your logic model? They're going to kind of assess the quality of what you submitted. If you're at the pre-preliminary level, they're going to assess the quality of the information you presented also, whether it's the data you shared, the research studies, and hopefully look to see that it was within the last 6 years. And if it aligns with something you propose in your logic model in terms of an outcome of interest. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and see what questions, if any, that you all have. And you can unmute your mic or put something in the chat.
I put it in the chat, but when you're
sorry.
talking about the evidence base, are we saying our program or our program with the additional support that we expect to get from AmeriCorps members?
You're giving evidence on the intervention you're proposing the AmeriCorps members are going to do. So what information do you have from the past that tells you if your members do this, you're likely to see the results you've outlined in your logic model. It could be, Anne, in your situation, if your staff currently provide case management services to young people and you've seen this level of success with those young people, you've collected data on some outcomes for them, then you believe if you bring members in to reach a larger audience, but doing the same thing,
Gotcha.
you should get the same results.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's essentially both. It's, we have this data that says what we do works. And because there's data that says that what we do works, when we train more people to do what we do, it's going to work for more people.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It could also be, Anne, that you find an evaluation, and I'll share a link in the chat. There's this site called the Evidence Exchange. It's AmeriCorps' place on their website where they house evaluations that have been done by other AmeriCorps programs.
Okay.
You could do a search and see if there are any communities and schools programs that have an evaluation on the Evidence Exchange. And if your program is doing a similar model, you could use that evaluation in your evidence.
Okay.
I'll put that in a little bit. Any other questions? Good question. We've hit the two hardest sections right there. The rest are much simpler. Okay. So still we're in this program design section. There's two more sections to go. We talked about the community and logic model. We talked about the evidence section. The third section is the notice priority. This is a section that if you're proposing a program that meets one of the priority areas that are outlined in the request for applications document, whether it's AmeriCorps priority areas or Virginia priority areas, then you'll talk about it. Okay. Every year in the notice of funding opportunity, AmeriCorps, the federal agency, lists priority areas that they're going to give more attention to and funding in that year. The Serve Virginia Commission is going to do the same. They're going to say these are priorities in Virginia that we want to make sure we give some priority to in decisions we make about funding. One of which I'm assuming will be youth mental health. So if you're proposing an intervention that meets one or more of the priority areas outlined, you'd want to talk about it. If you don't, which I'm assuming will not be the case, but if you don't, you can just put not applicable. But if you do, you want to write some narrative about it. You want to say, yes, we meet this priority area, and here's some proof as to why we do. From this point on, my suggestion to all grant applicants is that in every section we go over now, starting with member experience, you look at each bullet and you write narrative to it. These are criterias that the reviewers are going to be looking at in each section to assess you on in your narrative. And essentially starting here, it's really easy just to say for every bullet, write a paragraph. And write a paragraph that kind of opens the paragraph with a sentence from the criteria and then gives some meat to it in terms of proof that you are doing the criteria. Don't just say you're going to do something, talk about what specifically you're going to do. So for example, in this one, there's two criteria. The first paragraph you would write would speak to how AmeriCorps members are going to be provided leadership and skill development opportunities. We talked about the member experience. Here is where you're going to be talking about it. What are things you're going to do throughout the year to provide members skill building opportunities and leadership opportunities, which will mean you really have to start thinking through your program design now leading up to the application. This is your time to kind of really work this through. Your second paragraph will be about how your organization will provide members on an asset-based orientation to the community. So what they're asking for is how are you going to orient your members when they start their year or their term so that they see the communities they're going to be serving, whether it's the places like the schools or the organizations they're in or the actual communities themselves or the beneficiaries, their assets and strengths, in addition to the problems and deficits. So how are you going to frame the community from an asset-based perspective also? Okay, 2 paragraphs here. The same goes for every other section we're going to talk about. The next section, we've talked about executive summary, we've talked about program design. You also have organizational capability. Organizational capability has 3 subsections in it. Same thing here. For every bullet you see, you should write a paragraph about. So the first section you'll see here is about background and staffing of your organization. They're really wanting you to talk about it from your organizational perspective. So the first thing they want you to talk about is the roles, responsibilities, and structure of the staff that will be implementing and providing oversight to the program. So remember, one of the questions I was talking about earlier when we were talking about AmeriCorps foundations is you have to really think through your program model to determine what kind of staff structure you're going to have in place to support the program. If you have a program that's 10 members versus 50 members, that staff structure is very different. Because you're going to need a lot more people to support a 50-member program than you would for a 10. So you can talk about direct staff that will be on the grant, like a program director and a program coordinator. And you can also talk about, kind of behind the scenes organizational staff that will also provide support. Maybe you have an HR director, or you have the executive director of the organization that's going to dedicate some time to help get the program off the ground. You'll just talk about those positions and their particular roles and responsibilities. The second criteria is about your experience as an organization, your mission, and your experience in areas such as volunteer recruitment and management, community outreach, overcoming project implementation challenges, etc. So really just speaking to the mission of your organization and just some experience you've had in one or more of these areas. They just want to get a sense of, are you all as an organization, ready to take on a program that will have some of these responsibilities? And then the third paragraph you would write would speak to the third criteria, your experience with managing grants, especially federal or state, including your past performance with those grants. And if you haven't had experience, you would indicate that. Okay? We know that not everybody comes to AmeriCorps with experience in that, but they're trying to also assess your risk and to determine what supports will be provided to you all based upon that. And then finally, the last paragraph you would write is any experience you've had in facilitating, partnering, or participating in educational or workforce development programs as an organization. If you haven't, you haven't, and you say you haven't. If you have, you would talk about it. The next section in the organizational capability section is member supervision. So they want, essentially, you should have 2 paragraphs here, one for each of the criteria. The first one is talking about how your members will receive sufficient guidance and support from their supervisor to provide effective service. I'd really encourage you all that are on this call and the ones that will be listening to the recording to start taking the On3Learn Planning Grant series, and you could really look specifically at the member sections on member training, supervision. They'll give you really good ideas on things you should think about. And I'll reference that at the end if you have no clue what I'm talking about with On3Learn. So you're just going to need to talk about the support will provide the members, because that's a requirement of being an AmeriCorps program, is that you provide supervision to AmeriCorps members. And the second paragraph would be how you will train those people to provide that support to the AmeriCorps members. So Anne, in your case, you would talk about how the staff at communities and schools who will be supervising the day-to-day activities of the member will be trained on what they need to know in that role. The next one is the final section in this category is commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So that speaks to one of the legs of the stool we were talking about earlier. Actually, I should go back to something in a second, maybe think about it. There are 2 criteria here, 2 paragraphs. The first one is about how leadership and staff of your organization have similar lived experience as the beneficiary population in our community being served. That could be your board, it could be your staff, it could be your volunteers. And also the second one is how how you demonstrate as an organization your definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So give some examples of ways that you demonstrate that. I'm going to go back real quick to talk about something I didn't point out, which I always like to do because it throws people off. In the simplest section, I talked about the executive summary. There's one sentence that people are always like, what's this? The last sentence in the first paragraph is AmeriCorps members will leverage the number of leverage volunteers who will be engaged in what they'll be doing. All AmeriCorps programs are required to engage volunteers in the program in some form or fashion. It could be something simple where the AmeriCorps members are recruiting volunteers for a particular day, like maybe I'm thinking of communities and schools. Maybe you have one day where you do like a backpack stuffing day, and so you need volunteers to help with that. The AmeriCorps members could recruit volunteers for that. Or it could be something that's really intentional throughout the year. Maybe some programs have AmeriCorps members recruit volunteers who come in and do literacy days with the kids or help to build houses, whatever the program is. It is a requirement, so it is something you have to have in your executive summary, and it's something you should integrate into your program design. Again, it could be very simple and like a one-time event, or it could be something more long-term and intentional. Just want to go back to that and point that out. That's where that strength in communities leg came up. All right. The last section of the narrative is the budget section. You're actually going to be reviewed. This is similar to the community and logic model section where there's two things that are going to be reviewed to give your point awards. In this section, they're going to review some narrative that you write, and then they're also going to review your budget to make sure that they're both okay and they align. In the narrative, you have this section called cost effectiveness and budget adequacy section, and there's 3 sections: recruitment, retention, and data collection. These are 3 areas that typically programs either do really well or they struggle with. So they're wanting to know expenses that you are specifically allocating in these 3 areas in your budget. Okay. So first, with the recruitment, they want to know what expenses you're going to put in your budget to ensure you have successful recruitment of your AmeriCorps members, because you all recruit them, that are best suited to serve the community. That could be staff time. It could be memberships and things. It could be registration fees for college event tabling. It could be marketing materials, website redesign. It could be a whole bunch of different things. They also want you to talk about the living allowance and other benefits you provide that will ensure you are offering something that members will want to be a part. So if you're paying more than the minimum living allowance, or you're offering some other benefits that might be attractive to members, you would also talk about that here. We'll talk about that more in the budget when we get there, but these are things you're going to have to think through. Same thing with member retention. What expenses are you going to incorporate in your budget to support strong member retention? I'm going to again encourage you to go to the On 3 Learn Planning Grant series so you can get some ideas. It could be training that you're doing. It could be staff time and intensive supervision support that you're going to be providing. It could be certifications you're offering, or different incentives for the members, things that will help them want to stay throughout the program year, other than your great program model. And then the last area is data collection. Again, the same thing. You're going to have to write a paragraph of the actual expenses you're going to allocate in your budget for data collection. Again, this could be staff time to collect data. It could be for systems you use to collect the data in. It could be time for a consultant to help you with data collection, system development, a few different things in this area. I just want to stop and see if y'all have any questions about that. All right, so we're going to wrap up with just a few overall things that you need to think about with the application. One thing I'd like to tell applicants as you think about this overall application is that I think of your grant is a closet, and everything within the closet is what's allowable. So anything you put into that closet as a part of this grant application really determines what is allowable, unless it's not an allowable activity that you put in the closet, but that's a whole nother thing. So you need to really think about what you want your members to do, and that should be communicated in your narrative. And next week we'll talk about the logic model, because ultimately that determines what's allowable, what members can do with their time. So you'll really want to think about the broad scope of activities that you want your members to do and communicate that appropriately in your application, most of which will go into your logic model, and we'll talk about that next week. And then overall, some recommendations for you all. First, in terms of the system that you're going to use to submit your application, never start doing stuff in that system. Do everything outside of that system. You're going to have Word documents and Excel spreadsheets that you're going to be using for your budget, and the Word documents for your narrative and logic model and performance measures. And do that outside, whether it's in a Google Doc or in a simple Word document. Only put it in eGrants once you feel like it's final, and make sure you save those documents on your computer and never lose those, because they're going to be invaluable for you. eGrants should be your last stop to putting things in, but you'll want to start entering content as soon as you can, just in case you have hiccups. I'd say at least 1 week before your due date. The earlier the better. And you're going to have to test some things, like your narrative is at 11 pages as it prints out in eGrants. So you're going to have to test and make sure that's within the 11 pages. And if it's not, then you're going to have to play a game of cutting, which is always fun. But I do suggest that you don't stress too much about the page count. You write first, then you can cut later. I mean, don't go overboard. You're going to know when you're going way overboard, but really put your thoughts down on paper first. Don't constrain yourself at start. I also suggest to avoid parroting. Simply stating that you do the criteria is not okay. You have to provide details. They have to see that, yes, indeed, I see that they're gonna live out that criteria we're asking them to talk about. Make sure in your narrative you have clear and accurate area and section headings. So really make sure you keep those section headings that we just went through. eGrants doesn't recognize bold, italics, underline. So I typically all cap my headings, make them all cap letters so that they stand out. Double check your things of spelling. Nothing makes AmeriCorps reviewers more upset than people spelling AmeriCorps wrong. So please make sure you spell it with a capital A and a C and that PS at the end. We think lesser of you if you do that in your application. No, probably not lesser, but it annoys us. And don't just write things to make it sound like you're doing it. If you're not doing it, don't feel like you have to stretch yourself. I mean, be honest in your application and really speak to what you can speak to. Ultimately, the reviewers are going to evaluate the quality of your application based upon the criteria in the notice of funding documents or the request for applications that are sent out. So really pay attention to that criteria as it relates to the narrative. We'll talk about the other elements in the next webinars. And then finally, there's a lot of resources available to you all. The Serve Virginia website doesn't have the funding opportunity right now that you're going to be applying for, but they have past opportunities up there with a lot of great resources. I encourage you to go there. You all have full access to On3 Learn courses, which are courses that are put out there for the AmeriCorps field. We have courses for applicants on all of these elements, including a course on Is Our Organization a Fit, which helps you kind of understand the things that you're going to have to think about as an organization and managing an AmeriCorps state grant. And you can go to these courses after you take these ones that we're delivering and just reinforce some learning you did. And then we also have a more in-depth 2-part budget course that you can take. It's a staff course. That you all have access to all of them, so you can take those. I'd also encourage you to look at the planning grant courses because they have particular sections that might be helpful for you. There's a program design section, there's a member experience section, there's a getting members on board section that gets into recruitment and selection. So all those can help you think through elements for your narrative and also just get ready for program operation. And do any of y'all not know what I'm talking about when I say On3Learn courses? Okay, it sounds like, okay, good. All right. And then finally, this is the schedule. Next week, we'll be talking about the logic model. And then in December, we'll have 2 sessions, one on performance measures and one on the AmeriCorps budget. So stay tuned for that. Any final questions before we close out? I'm going to stop share real quick, and I'm going to also put in the link, the evidence exchange site. Meanwhile, if y'all have any questions, you can ask them.